where tens of thousands of home care workers employed to help elderly and disabled people wash, dress and cook for themselves are being paid below the minimum wage. Indeed, a recent report put that figure at just over 200,000, with many complaining they are not even being remunerated for their travel time between appointments, something which is essential for their job. Some earn as little as £5 per hour, too little for the most basic standard of living. Their treatment is not only immoral, but flagrantly illegal, and yet it remains widely ignored. Well, somebody who has first-hand experience of the home care system is Sara Walsh, who is now a representative of Unison here in Stafford, who is calling for a minimum wage to be paid to all home care workers and a scrapping of zero-hour contracts. Sarah, how can this be happening?
Well, basically, home workers who are in the communities travel between assignments to visit their service users. Their employers most often only pay for the time that's spent with that client and exclude the time that it takes the worker to get from each client within their sort of daily rotas. In some cases, you would have a home care worker who runs their own car, so it's their own car that they use, and they would be given a set of clients on what's called a run. So they would be expected to be, say, at client A at 7:30, 15-minute slot, and then client B, and if that would go on right to the end of wherever their shift finished. What would happen is when they arrive at the client, they would use a login system, and they would log that they were there, and then on their way out, they would do the same thing to exit the client. And so what you'd find is over a time period, they would have how long they spent with each client. And that should, in theory, cross-reference with their rota. But what they also have is companies would also then know what time they logged in at their first client and what time they exited their client. So between that, they would have had all the assignments that they went to that day. The time with each client would be lower than the time that they'd spent from point of arrival, first client, to exit at last client, but the employer would know what that time was. When they calculate the pay, they would calculate it two ways. So you'd have on the clients that they had at whatever the rate was, but then in theory they would know when they started and when they finished. If you then divided that by the hourly rate that they had been brought in on, you would find that actually for the work as a representative of that company would bring it down below, in most cases, national minimum wage. What companies do is put things like top-ups in wage slips, so you would see an additional amount, which unless you had your pay slip explained, looks like a bonus, whereas in actual fact it means that for all of those hours you just got minimum wage, but you may have taken a job where your understanding was £6-7 per hour, and that's not the case, so it's a little bit misleading in some cases.
Indeed, so doesn't it all boil down to how the home care is organised?
Most probably, and I think it's the recognising of staff who are travelling between assignments and not just the minute that they walk through a service user's door to carry out the tasks that are part of their job. There's this gap where they are travelling and nobody seems to recognise that whilst they're doing that, they are still representing that employer and therefore should be paid for that time.
So why do you think they haven't been up to now?
The majority of the companies that we've spoken to, where members or their employees have highlighted this, they will say that they're not being paid adequately by the local authorities, and they are only being paid for the time spent with the client, which is sometimes as little as 15 minutes. And therefore that's having a knock-on effect with what they then deem as being reasonable to pay that care worker for their time.
I've even heard cases where companies now who are bidding for these contracts are going online and doing it in the form of an eBay auction.
Yeah, I think the tendering process now is basically a drive, who can provide the service I don't necessarily think it's ever going to be the best service when you're driving down price to its minimum. But the effects of that is not necessarily on the profits of the company, because they will always look to make profit, but they will cut the terms and conditions of the workers who carry out those jobs for them to such a point that there is such instability in that market now, with 0-hour contracts, below minimum wage, not paid for travel, not paid to put petrol in your car, not paid for your tyres. There's so many things that have been taken off workers, but the profits of the company don't necessarily change. They will just cut all the terms and conditions so that they can win a contract. I think we're finding that the underbidding and the contracts that people have got, some may well be delivering excellent service, and it's not a slur on everybody in the industry, but there are companies who have been highlighted through the recent ETs and highlighted through members' cases that actually they are not what they are proclaimed to be.
And invariably then, the quality of care that the carer provides the elderly person or a disabled person must invariably suffer as a consequence.
Most definitely. The survey that UNISON did, which was to over, I think, 200,000 workers, suggested in the responses that carers felt that they didn't have time for the human contact that the people that they cared for deserved. There was not enough time to carry out the tasks and have the interaction with that client and then move on quickly to another client, which could be 5, 6, 10 miles away, to do another 15-minute slot.
What about the other argument where some will say that this is just purely a question of a squeeze on sort of social care budgets?
Well, no, because every council or every council's representative will tell us, and any member of the public, that their agenda sets out quite clearly that we must look after the sick, the vulnerable, and that would include elderly and children's care. So, a large proportion of whatever budgets are available have been put to care for elderly people. It just doesn't seem to be represented like that when you get down to the care workers and their opinions of the care that's being offered to those people.
Well, that may be the case, but some people may argue, well, the councils are doing their utmost to try and not abdicate their responsibilities, but when they have limited funds to play with, it's not so easy for them to, meet their targets.
That might well be the case, but then they're commissioning out services to companies who are expected to deliver high levels of care. These companies quite often are profit-making companies, so profit is being made, it's just not being distributed fairly. Now, I suppose a profit-making company has to look at the staff and the care of its staff and the duty of care it has to that staff and make less profit but provide better care. And if that isn't going to be the case, then they are squeezing all of the profit that they can from the company, and the council need to address that as a separate issue. They are driving down the industry to such a level that the results of their bad behaviour means that carers aren't getting to do their job properly, and ultimately the service user suffers. But they are vulnerable, and they are most often elderly, and they don't ever tell anybody. That's the problem. We never hear from them.
And this is it.
So they suffer in silence.
Why don't carers complain?
Carers, from the sort of research and the cases that I've dealt with, do complain to each other, do complain to people like us who, we have the ability to go and say things to companies and try and organise and, make them better. However, the old, the permanent contract where you were looked after by your company, I think those days have long gone now, and particularly in care where you've got 0 hours. The whole point being is your company doesn't have to give you any hours, doesn't have to pay you for, nil hours, and vice versa. So they are too frightened. If they say something, and they were on 30 hours last week, sort of a sudden they might be worried about something or raise a concern, and unfortunately companies will then not give them any work, which has a detrimental effect then on their family and home life.
So just in summary then, what would you like to see scrapped and what would you like to see introduced for carers in the UK if they are to be fully remunerated for their work, including the time they spend travelling to and from appointments?
I would like to see carers respected and valued for the vital work that they do within any community, care home or NHS, anything like that, any establishment like that. I'd like to see people who do domiciliary care or home care workers paid from the point they go into their first assignment to the point they leave their last assignment, like most workers are. I would like employers to pay them at least the living wage, not the national minimum wage, or the payment that they were taken on for per hour, instead of just levelling their payout to national minimum wage to meet their obligation. And I would also like to see the HMRC launch a full investigation into companies that don't do that for workers. So I'd like to see home care workers contact Pay and Rights Helpline to make complaints if they don't feel that their company is paying them the national minimum wage.
And just in conclusion then, I would like to end on a positive note, if that is at all possible. You were saying to me just before we came on air this evening that you as Unison had won a case, an employment tribunal, in which care workers now are being paid the minimum wage. What's the story behind that, briefly, if you would?
Well, it was an employment tribunal appeal. Unison helped care workers who were travelling between assignments take their case to the ET and won. And basically what that means now is people who are travelling in their day-to-day job to assignments should be paid at least the national minimum wage. And also for what's termed as sleepovers, where you would go to work but you wouldn't be required to work, you'd be sleeping in because of the ratio of numbers needed for shift. And most employers used to pay a flat rate of a certain amount of money because you technically would be asleep, with the chance of, you might have to get up in the night to do something or help somebody. And they've said no to all of that. You have to be paid at least the minimum wage for every hour that you are at work, which is a fantastic success story.
And just to say that we would like to hear your stories too if you are a home care worker. You can get in touch anonymously on 01785430000 or philip.anderson@staffordfm.co.uk. And hopefully in the future, the not too distant future that is, we will be going out and about shadowing one or two home care workers to find out exactly what it is they are up against. But in the meantime, Sara Walsh, representative of Unison here in Stafford, many thanks.
Thank you.